Hello and welcome to today's LHH webinar on how is organizational culture uh, increasing employee burnout. Um, my name is Alexandra Hertelendi. I'm a senior principal consultant here at LHH. And we are going to be talking about burnout today, which is a topic that I became increasingly curious about throughout the last year. Working with different clients, I've spotted a trend of people feeling exhausted and cynical at the same time, which got me to be curious about what's really happening and how is the pandemic um, making us experience more burnout. So we're looking to some stats pre and post pandemic, the cause and effect, and how the pandemic has exacerbated burnout. And then we look at how organizational culture can lead employees to be experiencing more burnout. But I won't leave you without some strategies that you could apply for the hybrid world. As Graham mentioned, we'll be using Mentimeter throughout, we'll be using the same code, which is 6765002027. If you haven't noted it down yet, don't worry, it will be on the screen every time we are interacting with it. And we'll be using the aggregate data from this Mentimeter for our insight base. For those of you who have used Mentimeter previously, you know that there's no personal data of yours that is being exchanged as such. So it is an anonymous aggregate data. However, should you have any concerns about it, then please just my recommendation would be not to submit a question. So I would really hope that many of you would to make it a really interesting interactive session. So let's start with talking about what is burnout. And interestingly enough, so it was 2019 when WHO have declared a burnout as an occupational phenomenon. And the reason for that was so that people could seek help and support for healthcare services for their occupational burnout. And their definition is characterizing burnout by three dimensions. The first one is feelings of energy depletion and exhaustion. The second is increased mental distance from one's jobs, feeling of negativism or cynicism, and reduced professional efficacy. And all of the three symptoms, three dimensions need to be present in order for burnout to be present. And the same definition is shared by Maslow later, who are great researchers into this topic, and they agree that all three need to be present in order for someone to be classified as having burnout. And why is this important? Because if you think about it, if you've only got a person who's massively exhausted, but they are still very engaged, very positive about the workplace, and are still very confident, your strategies to deal with that person would be very, very different to the person that who would be displaying all three of these symptoms. So what I would love to share is, how things were before the pandemic. And just before the pandemic, Gallup has conducted a research into burnout, which showed that more than 3/4 of employees around the globe have experienced burnout at least sometimes, with almost 30% of them experiencing burnout very often. So we can see that even before the pandemic, burnout was very, very much present in our organization, and there was a good reason for WHO declaring burnout as a occupational phenomenon. And Gallup's research has shown that burnt out employees are 63% more likely to take a sick day, They are 2.6 times more likely to be actively seeking another job. They are much less likely to discuss how to approach performance goals with their manager, and they are 30% less confident in their performance. And I think it's quite easy to see how, what are the business implications of burnout employees. If people aren't seeking out discussions around their performance with their managers, if they are less confident in their performance, that means that they are not bringing their best self to work, and therefore their performance will be hindered. And we know that there's a massive correlation as well between exhaustion and unethical behavior. And we know that ethical behavior on in turn has got a correlation to sales performance. So again, making sure that burnout is dealt with at its core is really important for the organization. And just before we go into how things have changed during the pandemic, I'm curious to see what was your experience with burnout. So if you could go to menti.com and enter the 8-digit code to answer the first question. So the number is 6765027. And I can already see there's 20 people responding. I never fail to be amazed about the wonder of this in this live representation. And I think the numbers are more or less stopping, but it feels to me that almost a third of you had experienced burnout in the last year or so. And another third of you, while you wouldn't yet classify yourself as having burnout, you did experience exhaustion during the last year. And in a minute, I will show you some very, very interesting data about how things have changed during burnout. But before doing so, I wanted to share the research that I've already referenced by Maslow, Jackson, and Leiter on the 6 main causes of burnout. And this is more than 20 years of research into burnout, despite of the fact that it was only in 2019 that WHO has declared burnout as an occupational phenomenon. So their research is showing that it's unsustainable workload, perceived lack of control, insufficient rewards toward effort, lack of supportive community, lack of fairness, and mismatched values and skills are the 6 main causes of burnout. And I don't want to give you way too many numbers. There's going to be plenty numbers shared today on this webinar with you. But it goes without saying that for all 6, there's sufficient correlation and causality between burnout and these causes, meaning that whenever an employee is experiencing a prolonged period of unsustainable workload, a perceived lack of comfort, lack of fairness, and so on and so forth, their likelihood of burnout is of experiencing burnout is significantly increasing. I would like to, however, draw your attention to how some of these causes are also causes for experiencing workplace to be less inclusive for certain individuals. So if you look at causes 4, 5, and 6, these are causes that are typically experienced, but what is being called these days diverse talent, they are much more likely to experience that. Especially number 6, so mismatched values and skills, whereby research is showing that it's more likely to be female talent whose skills are mismatched to the job that they are performing, in a sense that they are in pure terms overskilled for the job that they are doing, and just purely down to the fact that they might have taken maternity leave in the organizations, and they are continuing where they've left without getting the promotion. So before we go into the what happened during the pandemic, I wanted to reflect a little bit on the extent employees are able to influence these 6 burnout causes, in your opinion. So again, going to Menti, if you could give us your view on these 6 causes and the extent to you feel employees can influence either of these. So the first one being unsustainable workload, perceived lack of control, insufficient rewards towards effort, lack of supportive community, lack of fairness, and mismatched values and skills. And just as a reminder, yeah, so the results are coming through. The Menti code is 67650027 for those who have just joined. So what I'm saying on this graph, that you would tend to agree that there is a way of managing the unsustainable workload and managing perceived lack of control, insufficient rewards towards effort, lack of supportive community, the lack of fairness, and mismatched values and skills. But all of these are to an extent. So let's see, what we can do about it and what's happening in this space. So what happened during the pandemic? So if you think about the definition of burnout, one being exhaustion, during the pandemic, there was a much higher risk of exhaustion that people were reporting. Many people who were surveyed about burnout have reported increased workload. Some of that was down to the fact that organizations were concerned about the bottom line, and therefore, to use the expression, all hands were needed at the pump. Everyone pulled their sleeves out and pulled in more weight to make sure that there's no drop to the bottom line. Reversely, or if organizations were able to use the furlough program, those who were staying at work felt like that they need to make up for some people being on furlough. So all in all, generally people have reported increased workload during the time of the pandemic. And especially at times of lockdowns, people have lost their well-being routines. So while they had the opportunity to go to the gym or go to have a massage in some cases before the pandemic, that became impossible. And for many, even just walking home from the office would have given them that well-being routine to not cause exhaustion, and that has been lost and not sufficiently replaced in many of the cases. Many people have reported loss of connection with colleagues and with loved ones, and many have reported not enough support during the pandemic, which for those who ended up homeschooling, it's obvious what do we mean by not enough support. But at work, what it typically means that people have lost the water cooler moments, those moments where without much effort, people could seek out ideas or seek out, could just ask a simple question. And because of the simplicity and the seeming banality of these things, people don't feel like it's okay to ask these questions in chat or email form. And it just purely requires more effort these days. There's been also higher demands of non-paid work at home, and too many virtual interactions, and the blur of work-life boundaries, and the need to be always on, reported by many, all of which have left to a higher risk of exhaustion. On the other hand, there's been also a higher risk of inefficacy. The new models of work, everyone going virtual, required new skills for many. Well, some people would have worked from home from time to time. All of a sudden, everyone found themselves working from home, and not everyone fell into working from home and working virtually easily. There was also an increased uncertainty, which always has got a causality for inefficacy, and many digital distractions. And let's actually look at these digital distractions. So during the pandemic, the weekly meeting time has almost doubled. The weekly Teams chats per person have risen by 45%, and the number of emails and documents that we've been collaborating on with others have all increased. The really shocking is the trend, however, of this data. So this is being published by Microsoft Work Trend Index in March 2021. Despite of the fact that the vaccination program has started and many people are starting to go back to the office, the trend is telling us that this increase is continuing onwards, and is, on the other hand, masking this productivity is masking people's exhaustion. So that's something that we really need to look at when we are talking about burnout. The other element of this is, and something for our consideration, is that business leaders are faring much better than their people. So in the same survey, how people are feeling, whether they are thriving or just about surviving, what came out very strongly, that business leaders are disconnected from people who are working, who are in the Generation Z, from work-life workers, or people who have just recently joined the organization, and they've never been able to connect with others, single people, working moms, or married with children. So again, that tells us a story that we need to bring the leaders closer, and their awareness of what's really happening, closer to what the truth is, and how it manifests in terms of burnout. This is the first piece of data, is, from my perspective, one of the most important for us to consider whenever I'm thinking about any strategies going forward. And that is that employee capacity to absorb change without becoming fatigued has shrunk by 50% compared to 2019. The people will get exhausted much quicker, but it doesn't mean that their resilience have significantly dropped. The reason for this is just purely the amount of change that people have experienced at home, outside outside of home, at work, has been so vast that people are genuinely more fatigued, and therefore their absorption of change is much lower. But the other thing which comes from that graph of just the pure amount of virtual meetings that we are having, is that employees are 2.5 times more likely to experience digital distractions at work from work. In essence, what it means that employees can practically never get into a flow, cannot find a streak of uninterrupted time where they can get into the flow, where they can create their best work, because they will be disrupted at one point in time. And obviously the bad news is, which is a result of the graph that I showed before, is that women are feeling more burnt out than men. And it's at the mid-level of leadership where these differences are the most prevalent, which, if you consider which part of their life, women in mid-level leadership are, potentially being moms and or caring for others, it's not a surprising statistic at all. So what I'm curious about is, again, using Menti, is what are you observing, and how is burnout showing up in your organization? And just to give you an example as to what do I mean by this question. So the things that I've observed in some of the organizations that I've been working with is people started to deprioritize team meetings, and therefore not joining those opportunities where there could be innovation, where there could be things that are helping to sort some problems. And I can see some of you already sharing that there's leavism in your organization, lack of engagement. Caring less about others is a really, really important one. When someone is reaching burnout, their capacity to care about others is obviously decreasing. Higher resignation, increased absenteeism, lack of one-to-ones, conflict, higher turnover rate, change in the attitude. A lot of individuals are becoming flippant and feeling vulnerable about sharing the actual feelings. Less tolerant behaviors, they are niggly, more focused on business as usual rather than development. Low level of trust, expectation to work all hours, drastically reduced empathy, feeling devalued, irritability. These, it just shows me, your answers are just showing me, and the less creative is, why is this a big program? You are, we are, because of burnout, we are leaking talent. The work is becoming less human, and there's also less creativity. So people are not feeling that they can bring their A game. Switching off sickness and long working hours. So let's see what we could do about it. But before we do that, let's just summarize some good news, bad news about burnout and where we are. So one element to highlight is, you've seen that there's a high percentage of burnout that is within the control of the individual, and then there's a high element of the burnout that is within the control of the organization and looking at the culture. And research has shown that proactive burnout prevention is effective, i.e., if people invest upfront in their well-being, they are much less likely to be feeling burnout. The bad news, however, is employees who are already suffering from burnout, so who got there or who got there quicker, they don't have the resources to invest in proactive behaviors. So if you are telling someone who is absolutely at the burnout stage to take 5 minutes for meditation, then that's exactly the last thing that they would want to hear, because they literally cannot physically do it. The other good news about burnout is, in case you are able to increase job resources, so some of the things that you were mentioning there, so giving people feedback, giving them development opportunities, giving them more autonomy. Those elements, which we would classify as job reducers, are very, very effective way of reducing burnout. In other terms, in case burnout is caused by a very high number of very high workload, that if you are able to increase the job resources, then you are more likely to be able to prevent burnout from happening, and can catch it much earlier on. And the other good news is that burnout reduces with the increase of team effectiveness. So the more you can focus and build teams to be real effective teams who know how to operate together, so they aren't just a bunch of individuals coming together because they are reporting to the same managers, but as long as they are able to operate as an effective team, which is resilient, which is creative together, that would definitely lead to a reduced burnout. And the other good news is that when it comes to digital distractions, that is something that can be managed to reduce the exhaustion, which subsequently could lead to burnout. The bad news about burnout, I've already mentioned that those employees who already are suffering for burnout wouldn't be able to take any proactive measures. We've seen from the extent to how much employees were able to influence the 6 causes of burnout. If you focus on strategies only on individuals, so if you're only focusing on well-beings, that won't help burnout from reoccurring. The other bad news, and I think this is really, really important to highlight, the most engaged and passionate employees will be the ones that are most prone to burnout. Reason being, they find it much more difficult to put in some of the boundaries that would help them to prevent the exhaustion, but that also means that they would flip very easily into cynicism and exhaustion, and therefore being burnt out. And we've also seen from the numbers during the pandemic, the bad news, that it is your most diverse talents that you probably have been working really hard, not just last year, but the previous years to. They are the ones who are most likely to experience burnout. And again, the reason being is it is still the diverse talents who finds it more exhausting to show up at work as someone else than they are, when they feel like the organization is not inclusive enough. They need to put in more resources in order to show up, subsequently leading to their exhaustion, subsequently leading to their burnout. So before I go into the consideration for the hybrid word, are there any questions, Graham, so far in the Q&A, which are with regards to everything else that I've just shared?
So we had one question around, are there any differences between countries when it comes to employee burnout?
Really, really good question. Thank you for that, Graham. The answer is yeah. There's a really interesting, the Microsoft research that I have already referenced, actually showed that in sort of the Latin American countries, people are more connected than, for example, in Europe, in EMEA, and therefore they feel less burnt out than people in EMEA, in some of the European countries. So there is definitely a cultural difference that is affecting burnout, that needs to be taken into consideration. But these changes are something that are you could explain it by the culture. If you were to use our slight prejudices about Latin America versus a person in Britain. You could say that, you know, they are more family focused. They are more likely to be connected with family, but also families more likely to be living together in bigger numbers. So could be explained by that. However, having said that, the 6 causalities are just as applicable in Latin America like in EMEA. So there's nothing in both cases you would want to address, because even though burnout is lower in Latin America, it has still increased during the pandemic. So it needs to be addressed in all countries. Thank you for the question. Right, so then moving on to some considerations for the hybrid world. And you probably have conducted your own individual surveys on this topic. But something we need to very, very deeply consider, that in a survey, almost 3/4 of employees said that they want flexible remote work options to stay, and almost 7 in 10 employees said that they want more in-person work or collaboration post-pandemic. And if we think about this is again another disruptive change in the way we are working, because, you know, why the pandemic has forced most of us to be working virtually. Now the next step is, I know, how do we share our time between the office and working virtually, and how we will make it happen to be inclusive, and how will we make sure that it happens in a way that is not causing exhaustion to either of us. So these are major considerations for the months to come. And the things that we would be looking at is looking at mindsets and beliefs, behaviors. You know, what do leaders value, processes, systems, and artifacts in the organization? And what do we mean by that? Is, you know, the mindset and the beliefs that leaders hold. An example being, you know, the need to tightly control the financials would typically result in certain behaviors within the organizations that you know, would create a feeling of exhaustion or burnout, or lack of fairness or unsustainable workload. And the things we would always look at, because almost the key to unlocking the mindset and beliefs that are driving the behaviors is what do leaders value. And this is not the alignment between organizational values, though in very, very strong cultures you would hope to see a strong alignment between the two, but it's more down to the fact of, where do leaders spend their time on? What do leaders spend their time on? Is it calls? Is it numbers? Is it KPIs? Where do they spend their time? And so what do they reward? What's being rewarded in the organization? And these questions need to be very, very thoroughly examined to look into organizational culture, and then therefore, you know, how it leads into burnout. And lastly, you know, the processes, the systems, and all the artifacts, the cultural artifacts, pictures that you are using, the slide deck that you are using, are again sending really, really strong signals, and can be reinforcing some of those behaviors that can lead to those 6 causes of burnout that we've already discussed. So let's look at some examples of clients that we've worked with, and how their cultures were leading into burnout. So one client is a multinational organization who is such a large organization. They are always under public scrutiny. So therefore they are determined to do things right and do the right thing, but it very, very often comes at the cost of their managers, who are feeling that they need to keep the operations going, but also they need to provide care for their people, and they are, because they need to be in charge of everything, it leads to their exhaustion. Another example is a hurry up engineering giant, which is an organization that has moved to an agile way of working. And while that has got its benefits, the language used around the agile of ways of working, sprinting, um, um, has meant that it created a culture whereby people felt like that there's no time for anything, that there's never time to have the conversations, and that the big issues were never tackled, which in effect led to burnout in an organization. And lastly, another example of a boutique startup agency, where the founders of this agency were a bunch of individuals who knew each other from the back of the good old days. And they didn't appreciate that they are creating a culture where they are the inner club, and everyone who's joining the organization is sort of the outsider of this club, who almost like have to really work hard and harder to be feeling accepted, and to feel like their opinion mattered. Again, subsequently leading many people to leave the organization and to burn out. So what can be done? So what could we do about this? We've created the 4C strategy to avoid or deal with burnout, that stands for care, create, craft, and connect. And these stand for the following. So care is continuing the preventing well-being measures that I'm ever so certain that most of your organization have got in place, have got a well-being program in place. We've just had well-being week all of last week. You've probably been promoting some of your EAP programs. The key thing, however, is again making sure that it is tackled from an organizational culture perspective. We need to look at who and how talks about this. It cannot be an HR initiative. And also the other things, when it comes to well-beings and all the good things that we talk about when we talk about looking after people's well-beings, we need to be conscious that these need to be integrated or even harmonized into work. What do I mean by that? Running or going for a 30-minute walk, or taking time out for meditation cannot be something that gets sacrificed the moment there are further demands at work. If we were to think about that, this is something that needs to be harmonized into our work and seen as, should I do this, I will do a better work, and not as this is an add-on that I should be doing while I'm already tired. That it's much more likely that people will take this on and able to reap the benefits of those preventative burnout measures that we've been talking about. But the other element that needs to be highlighted when we are talking about care as the first strategy of preventing or tackling burnout is ensuring that managers know what burnout is, that they know that it is the combination of exhaustion, cynicism, and efficacy, to be able to address it with the right with the right strategies. The second element, and this is the one that I completely appreciate, this is easier said than done, is creating a psychologically safe, fair environment. So this is, you know, which goes back to the organizational culture and the importance of readers role modeling. And this is what goes back to the element of, you know, what gets measured gets run. What the leaders are rewarding is the feel of the culture that they are creating. So, you know, if they are way too focused on about numbers and the bottom line, despite everyone pulling the biggest ways, you know, that sends a message, and that can send a message of being a less inclusive environment where people don't feel like they belong, despite of the fact that both of these metrics, inclusion and belonging, again have got a positive correlation to reducing burnout in the organization. The next element on of strategy, and all of these need to be happening subsequently, and that you will see that many correlate and are interconnected with each other. But then the next element that needs to happen in order to prevent burnout is looking to how to create meaningful jobs to have resourceful employees. Research has shown that if employees are able to spend 20% of their working time, so that's a day a week for those working full time, to something that they find meaningful, they would almost they're the least likely to experience burnout. So for that, the really popular term these days, job grafting, can work a lot to allow people to think about, you know, what is it that is giving meaning, how are they creating meaning, and what's the purpose of their job, to have that as a North Star, and also to be able to then create a work day and a work week that works better for them. Obviously, giving autonomy to people would lead to less of a burnout. But here's the watch out with autonomy. Again, it's not enough to say to people you've got autonomy to manage your week the way to your liking. It doesn't apply if people's calendars are being filled up by meetings by their managers that they don't feel like they can decline. So again, it needs to work very closely with that, creating a safe working environment. We've already talked about matching skills and values, the causalities of burnout, but you know, when we are crafting the jobs, when we are defining what the jobs look like, we do need to ensure that people's skills and values are well matched, and swift action to be taken if someone is purely overqualified for their jobs, and look at ways of and possibilities for developing them and grooming them to, you know, the right level of their abilities. And lastly, you know, development and processes is something that's very important on the craft side. And finally, connecting. We know from research into diversity and inclusion how important the existence of employee resource groups are to make a dent in the feeling of inclusions. So so having the employee resource groups and creating the inclusivity and putting in the actions and the signals that things are happening about you know, the lack of fairness, for example, or the lack of supportive community, is something that the ERGs are really, really useful mechanisms when it comes to tackling burnout. But going back to the high performing teams, so this is the element where you know, in the past, most of the development would be going into the talent, into specific leaders to equip them with leadership skills. that's, we know it on the create side, it's really important because they need to be able to create a psychologically safe environment. But it is, we cannot forget how important it is for the leaders to know how to lead high performing teams, how to bring a bunch of individuals together to be teams, because especially in the hybrid work where people will be, some of them will be working from home, some of them will be working in the office. If the teams are able to pull together, they are much less likely to be sacrificing anyone, or not caring about anyone. Sacrificing being probably a too strong word. And that leads me to say that, there needs to be a meeting etiquette for the hybrid world, but I will go further than that. When we look at our offices, we really need to think about what is it that we need, where is it that we need to invest in technology, because looking at my organization, when one of the reasons we weren't working that often virtually before the pandemic is because those who were in the office, their sound quality was so bad that people who were working virtually couldn't hear, and vice versa. So we do need to look at how do we create inclusivity, level play fields for everyone, irrespective of where they work, going forwards. So before we open up the floor for questions, I'm just curious as to what are your key takeaways from today's presentation? What actions are you going to take? And just a reminder, if you've got any questions, if you could put it into the Q&A section, that would be great. But again, so using Menti and using the same code, which is 67650027, I'm curious, what are your key takeaways, or what actions are you going to take after the call? I can see love the 4-seed. Yeah, it's a really important one, that your most engaged employees are the most at risk of burnout. They are also the most at risk of leaving the organization if nothing is being done of burnout. So should burnout be reoccurring for them due to those 6 elements, they are much more likely to leave the organization. Yeah, there's a big relationship between burnout and DNI. And actually, if you heard me talking, it's mostly the same things that are causing burnout are the same things that are making the organization and the culture feeling less inclusive. Yeah, the diverse talent may also be more likely affected. Sharing knowledge with the rest of the team globally so we can create consistent initiatives. The 4Cs. Yeah, I didn't know a burnt out employee is more susceptible to say no to a 5-minute break. Actually, that's the case. They are unfortunately, they haven't got the resources and the bandwidth. So the strategies for them is you wouldn't want to send them on a webinar about burnout. They won't benefit from it. You would want to have a conversation and get deeper into what's really happening, and find different ways of supporting people. Yeah, I can see that someone is thinking about connecting the annual survey to the key burnout causes will be useful to create a burnout index. Absolutely. There's a for those of you who are considering something like this, there's a fantastic survey, areas of work life survey, that has been developed by Maslach later, who are the researchers into burnout. So they should be able to share some fantastic takeaways. And I'm curious if there are any questions or comments that we can address in the remaining 9 minutes that we've got left on this call. So, Graham, have you got any questions?
The first is, has a shift in the 4-day working week been beneficial in terms of proactively decreasing burnout at all?
So this is my personal opinion, because I haven't seen the research which confirms the correlation and causality. I'm assuming that because of the shift of into a 4-hour work week, very, very often resulted in resetting some of the expectations, resetting some of the drivers that are the drivers of the burnout of and how people are talking about, workload and so on and so forth. And obviously people are taking an additional day off work because of those, setting those boundaries. I would assume that it should benefit with the burnout. Having said that, there's no research that I've seen that put the correlation, 2 and 2 together. So it's more a logical connection that I'm seeing instead of a researched one. Hope that helps.
We've also got, is role modeling by senior employees the best way to prevent burnout?
Absolutely. It's definitely one of the most important elements. If the curiosity that leaders need to have about what's really going on for people, because we've seen the massive gap between how leaders are thinking. They're thinking that things are much better than they are, so they need to become first curious about what's going on for people in order then to role model the right behavior, not to send emails at 3 o'clock because something popped into their house and expecting people to answer, or literally, not to drive, not to expect someone to deliver something by yesterday if they have been reporting a sustained period of really high workload. So they need to be really curious as to what's really happening in order for them to role model the right curiosity, but B, then to challenge their beliefs and their assumptions of what they are holding about what the business needs and how the business needs to operate, and then with that utilizing more their talent and create a culture where there's more conversation happening and people aren't being driven out because they are just feeling like they have to work too much in a very challenging time.
Another question on any advice for leaders regarding dealing with burnout before it becomes burnout. So preventing rather than reacting, and what would be the best early interventions?
I think there's 2 key elements that that leaders need to really, really watch out for, which is the exhaustion and the cynicism. Because the cynicism, you're having disengaged employees, and obviously the exhaustion is quite clear. So a couple of things that I would immediately recommend is role modeling, taking time out and looking after themselves and talking about the importance of that and how it benefited them and how it helped them with their workload. So that's to tackle the exhaustion, making sure that they leave and they talk about it and they talk about how it benefited them. The second element is the moment they are hearing cynicism, is to be curious about it. It's to really dig underneath it and so even say the words, say, oh, that's interesting, oh, I'm curious about it, so what's happening for you, and showing that they care, because these are the 2 elements that are much easier to pick out. Inefficacy is something that people wouldn't necessarily be open about when they are starting to doubt themselves, but definitely showing that the need for taking time off, for looking after themselves, not driving themselves crazy with the workloads, and not driving everyone crazy by them having the drive is step number 1, and asking the right question would be step number 2. And these are the first 2 things that I would recommend amongst many others.
One final question about the 4 C's. So what do you think could be the barriers to implementing them in my business?
expecting quick fixes. I very often hear when talking about burnout, wanting to find a silver bullet for things. Yeah, let's give people an app. Let's give a webinar. Let's make sure all the managers know what burnout is. And these are all good things, but it cannot be a one-off intervention because it's not going to shift the dial. It needs to be an approach that looks into all the 4 C's together and almost identifies the lowest hanging fruit and immediately looks at them. And then finding that, that one meaty element in each of them, which might be the same theme throughout, and tackling those first, and showing the people that something is happening. Because the worst thing that an organization can do is say that they are going to do something about it and then nothing happening at the back of it. This is something that came out during the last year's Black Lives Matter movement. Those organizations who said they're going to do something about it, however, they really haven't done anything at the end of the day. Their employees have become much more disengaged than those organizations who didn't say they're going to do something about it but didn't do anything about it. So the penalties are paid much harder. There's no more questions. I think there's a question from Timmy Chung. Timmy, I will share because I'm conscious that it's 12 o'clock, so many people will have to log out. But there's been the Mayo Clinic in the US has been really successful in preventing burnout. Trivago is also an organization who I would say to look up and have a look as to how they are tackling these scenarios. So on that note, I would just like to say thank you so much for dedicating a whole hour of your time for today's presentation. It's been a pleasure to be your host, and do give us a shout if we could be of any service to you.